I woke up from sedation for a colonoscopy 12 weeks pregnant. The anesthesiologist was alone with me for 3 hours. I'm staring at the pregnancy test in my hands, showing 2 dark lines, while my husband Kevin stands in the bathroom doorway asking how this is possible. We haven't had sex in 4 months. I've been dealing with severe gastrointestinal issues that made intimacy painful, and we'd both been too stressed and exhausted to even try. The last time was in early January, and it's now late April. I'm 12 weeks pregnant according to the test, and the dating doesn't match anything in our recent history. Kevin's face goes from confusion to something harder when I say the only time I was unconscious and vulnerable in the past 3 months was during my colonoscopy in late January. I'd gone in for a routine procedure to investigate my stomach issues. Standard sedation. The gastroenterologist Dr. Raymond Kiao performed the exam and everything was supposed to be normal, except the recovery took longer than expected. Much longer. When I finally woke up disoriented and foggy, the recovery nurse told me I'd had a reaction to the anesthesia, and they'd monitored me for extended time. She said the anesthesiologist Dr. Philip Castellanos had stayed with me personally to ensure my safety. Kevin's hands are shaking when he asks if I'm suggesting what he thinks I'm suggesting. I don't know what I'm suggesting because my brain can't process the implications. But the math is unavoidable. Conception happened approximately 12 weeks ago, which was late January. The colonoscopy was January 28th. I was sedated for what should have been a 30-minute procedure, but according to the discharge papers, I didn't leave until 3 hours later. The paperwork says I had adverse reaction to propofol and required extended monitoring. But now I'm pregnant and there's only one time in the past 4 months I was unconscious and someone had unrestricted access to my body. I tell Kevin we need to go to the hospital immediately. He's asking if I'm sure about the timeline and I'm saying I've never been more sure of anything. I track everything in my health app. I know exactly when we last had sex and I know exactly when my colonoscopy was. The dates align perfectly with a pregnancy that should be impossible. The emergency room doctor listens to my story with an expression that starts skeptical and becomes increasingly disturbed. Dr. Lisa Yoon is in her 40s with sharp eyes that miss nothing. She orders an ultrasound and blood work without hesitation. The ultrasound technician is a young woman named Amy who goes quiet when she hears why we're here. She measures the fetus carefully and confirms gestational age of 12 weeks and 2 days. The conception date would be late January, between the 24th and 28th. Dr. Yoon asks again about the colonoscopy, and I show her the discharge paperwork. She reads the section about extended recovery and her jaw tightens. She asks if I remember anything unusual about waking up. I tell her I don't remember anything after they started the sedation until I woke up in recovery feeling strange. Not just groggy from anesthesia, but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I'd had soreness that I attributed to the procedure itself. Internal soreness that seemed excessive, but the discharge nurse said some discomfort was normal. I'd also noticed I was wearing my underwear differently than I'd put it on that morning, but I'd been too disoriented to question it. Dr. Yoon's face is grim when she says she's calling hospital administration and the police. She says if what I'm suggesting is true, this is sexual assault of an incapacitated patient. She says the evidence is clear in the pregnancy itself, but we need to document everything immediately. She performs a pelvic exam and notes everything in clinical detail. She takes photographs of my body even though there are no visible injuries after 3 months. She collects DNA samples and documents the pregnancy. She asks if I want a rape kit done even though significant time has passed. I say yes to everything. I want every piece of evidence documented because I know what's coming. I know people won't want to believe this. A respected anesthesiologist at a prominent hospital sexually assaulting a sedated patient sounds too horrific to be true. But the pregnancy test in my purse and the ultrasound images prove something impossible happened. Hospital security arrives first, 2 uniformed guards who look uncomfortable with the situation. Then 2 police officers. Detective Angela Morrison is a woman in her 50s with gray hair and an expression that suggests she's seen everything. Detective James Reeves is younger, maybe 35, with a notebook he fills rapidly as I talk. They take my statement in a private room away from the emergency department bustle. I explain the timeline methodically. No sexual activity for months before the procedure due to my gastrointestinal issues making intimacy too painful. Kevin and I had been dealing with my health problems and barely had energy for daily life, let alone sex. Our last intimate encounter was January 3rd, confirmed by my period tracking app and text messages to my friend where I'd complained about the pain. Then nothing until the colonoscopy on January 28th. The procedure was scheduled for 9 a.m. I was sedated around 9:15 according to my memory. I woke up around 12:30 p.m. according to the discharge paperwork. 3 hours and 15 minutes from sedation to waking, for a procedure that should take 30 to 45 minutes maximum. Detective Morrison asks about the anesthesiologist, and I tell her Dr. Philip Castellanos was listed on my paperwork as the attending anesthesiologist. She asks what I remember about him before the procedure. I say he came into the pre-op area and introduced himself. He was in his late 40s, average height, slightly overweight with thinning brown hair. He wore glasses and spoke in a soft voice that was meant to be reassuring. He asked about my medical history and allergies. He explained the sedation process and said I'd be comfortable and wouldn't remember anything. He'd smiled when he said that last part. I remember thinking it was a kind smile. Now the memory makes my skin crawl. He explained he'd monitor me throughout the procedure to ensure my safety. He said I was in good hands. I'd trusted him completely because he was a medical professional in a hospital where I was supposed to be safe. Detective Morrison asks if he was alone with me during the extended recovery. I say I don't know because I was unconscious. She asks if the recovery nurse or gastroenterologist stayed. I say I don't remember seeing anyone except Dr. Castellanos when I briefly woke during what I thought was the procedure. I have a hazy memory of opening my eyes and seeing him standing over me. I thought he was checking my vital signs. He'd said something about me being beautiful when he thought I was fully unconscious. I'd been too disoriented to process it at the time and later convinced myself I'd dreamed it. But now that memory takes on sinister meaning. He'd said I was beautiful while I was sedated and helpless. Detective Reeves is already on his phone calling the hospital's chief of surgery. The hospital administrator who arrives an hour later is defensive and dismissive. Gerald Hutchins is in his 60s with silver hair and an expensive suit. He says there must be some mistake in my timeline. He suggests I'm confused about when I last had intercourse. Maybe Kevin and I had sex and I'd forgotten due to the medications I was taking for my gastrointestinal issues. He says false accusations against medical professionals are very serious and I need to be absolutely certain before making such claims. He emphasizes Dr. Castellanos' reputation as an excellent anesthesiologist with 15 years of experience. He suggests that stress from my health issues might be affecting my memory and judgment. Kevin explodes and says his wife is telling the truth and the hospital needs to take this seriously immediately. He says we know exactly when we last had sex and it doesn't line up with this pregnancy. He says the only explanation is that something happened during the colonoscopy. Dr. Yoon cuts in before Hutchins can respond. She says the medical evidence is unambiguous. She says I'm 12 weeks and 2 days pregnant with a conception window of late January. She says the only time I was unconscious and in a medical setting during the conception window was at this hospital during a colonoscopy where Dr. Castellanos had extended unsupervised access. She says my discharge paperwork documents an unusually long recovery time explained as adverse reaction to anesthesia. She says the hospital needs to secure all records and surveillance footage immediately before anything disappears. She tells Hutchins directly that if he's more concerned about protecting the hospital's reputation than investigating a potential assault, she'll report him to the medical board herself. Hutchins' face goes pale. He says he'll cooperate fully with the investigation, but he's certain this is a misunderstanding. He says Castellanos is married with children and has never had any complaints. Dr. Yoon says predators often appear normal and family status means nothing. Detective Morrison says misunderstanding or not, they're treating this as a sexual assault case and the hospital needs to preserve all evidence immediately. She demands the procedure room logs, all surveillance footage from January 28th, Dr. Castellanos' schedule, recovery room records, nursing notes, and any other documentation. She wants the names of everyone who was working that day and their statements. She wants to know who else was in the building and where cameras are located. Hutchins makes calls and within an hour the hospital's legal team arrives. 3 attorneys in expensive suits immediately start talking about patient confidentiality and proper legal procedures for obtaining medical records. The lead attorney is Victoria Lang, a woman in her 50s who radiates expensive education and corporate ruthlessness. She says they'll provide requested materials but need time to compile everything properly. She says the hospital takes these allegations extremely seriously, but must balance investigative needs with protecting patient privacy for others who were being treated that day. Detective Reeves says they'll get a warrant if necessary, but it would be faster if the hospital cooperated voluntarily. Victoria Lang says they'll begin gathering materials tonight, but some items like surveillance footage require IT department retrieval and archived records need to be pulled from storage. She says they'll have everything within 48 hours. Detective Morrison says that's too long and evidence could be destroyed. Lang says accusing the hospital of evidence tampering is inflammatory and unhelpful. She says they're taking this seriously but can't drop everything immediately without proper procedures. The standoff continues until Dr. Yoon points out that every minute they argue is time someone could be erasing files. She says she's worked at this hospital for 8 years and knows how fast digital records can disappear when administration is worried about liability. Victoria Lang's expression hardens and she makes a call. 20 minutes later, the IT director arrives to begin securing files under police supervision. The police obtain a comprehensive warrant that evening and seize records from the hospital. They also bring Dr. Castellanos in for questioning. I'm not present, but Detective Morrison tells me later what happened. Castellanos came to the station with his own attorney, a criminal defense lawyer named Marcus Blackwell who specializes in defending doctors accused of misconduct. Castellanos denied any wrongdoing calmly and consistently. He said I was never alone with him. He claimed the recovery nurse Beth Kowalski was present the entire time during my extended monitoring. He said the adverse reaction to propofol was genuine and required careful observation. He said he'd monitored my vitals and ensured I was stable. He said suggesting he'd assaulted me was absurd and offensive. He said I was obviously confused about my timeline or having an affair and trying to cover it up. Blackwell said his client had an unblemished record and wouldn't dignify these baseless accusations with further comment. But when they interview nurse Beth Kowalski, her story is different. Beth is in her 30s with red hair and a nervous demeanor. She confirms she was assigned to recovery that day and was with me initially after the procedure, but approximately 30 minutes into my recovery, she was called away to help with another patient who'd had complications from a different procedure. The patient had gone into respiratory distress and needed immediate intervention. Beth said Dr. Castellanos told her he'd monitor me personally and would call if he needed assistance. She'd hesitated because leaving a patient during recovery wasn't standard protocol. But Castellanos was an anesthesiologist and technically qualified to monitor recovery. He'd assured her it was fine and she was needed urgently elsewhere. She'd been gone for approximately 2.5 hours helping stabilize the other patient who ultimately had to be transferred to ICU. When she returned to check on me, I was starting to wake up and Dr. Castellanos was sitting beside my bed charting. He told her I'd been stable throughout and was ready for discharge soon. That's 2.5 hours where Dr. Castellanos was alone with my unconscious body in a recovery bay. Detective Morrison asks Beth if that was normal protocol. Beth says absolutely not. Standard practice is continuous nursing presence during recovery. But the other patient's emergency had been real and critical. She'd made a judgment call that Castellanos could monitor me temporarily. She'd never imagined anything inappropriate would happen. She'd trusted him because he was a respected colleague. Morrison asks if Beth noticed anything unusual when she returned. Beth thinks for a moment, then says my gown had been adjusted differently than how she'd positioned it initially. She'd assumed I'd moved during recovery, or that Castellanos had adjusted it for some medical reason. She also says I'd seemed more disoriented than typical patients recovering from propofol. But adverse reactions varied, and she'd attributed my confusion to the extended sedation time. She asks Morrison if something really happened to me. Morrison says that's what they're investigating. Detective Morrison tells me all this 2 days after my initial report. She says they're requesting Dr. Castellanos' medical license records, personnel files from all hospitals where he's worked, and any previous complaints or disciplinary actions. She says they're also requesting DNA samples for paternity testing. I give my own DNA sample and consent for prenatal DNA testing to determine paternity. The hospital fights this initially through their lawyers. Victoria Lang argues that forcing a physician to provide DNA based solely on timeline coincidence sets a dangerous precedent. She says there's no direct evidence of assault, only suspicious circumstances. She says compelling medical professionals to provide DNA for every patient accusation would open the floodgates for baseless claims. She says the hospital has an obligation to protect its employees from unfounded allegations that could destroy careers. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Nathan Cruz, files motions arguing that the pregnancy itself is evidence of sexual assault. He says I was unconscious and incapacitated during a medical procedure. Any sexual activity during that time is by definition non-consensual. He says the timeline clearly indicates conception during the procedure. He says DNA comparison is essential to the investigation, and refusing to provide it suggests consciousness of guilt. He says if Castellanos is innocent as he claims, the DNA test will prove it and clear his name. The judge, an older woman named Judith Kowalski, reviews the arguments and orders Dr. Castellanos to provide DNA samples. She says the pregnancy constitutes sufficient probable cause for the test. She says patient safety during medical procedures is paramount and credible allegations must be investigated thoroughly. Castellanos' attorney Marcus Blackwell files an appeal but is denied. Castellanos provides DNA samples under protest. The paternity results take 2 weeks because we need specialized prenatal testing that analyzes fetal DNA from my blood sample. Kevin and I spend that time in a horrifying limbo. He's supportive, but I can see the doubt creeping in despite himself. Late at night, he asks gentle questions about whether I'm absolutely certain about our timeline. He suggests maybe we had sex and I'd forgotten because of the pain medications I was taking. He wonders if I could have been confused about dates. I show him my tracking app with detailed logs of every symptom, every medication, every period, every migraine. I show him text messages from January where I told my friend Allison about the upcoming colonoscopy. I show him calendar entries marking the procedure date. I show him journal entries about my health struggles where I documented that we hadn't been intimate because it hurt too much. The evidence is irrefutable, but he's struggling because accepting the truth means accepting that his wife was raped while unconscious in a medical facility. It's easier for his brain to search for alternative explanations than to face that horror. We also face questions from family. My mother calls after hearing through Allison that I'm pregnant. She's excited until I explain the circumstances. Then she goes silent. She asks if I'm absolutely sure about what happened. She says Dr. Castellanos seems like such a nice man from his photo on the hospital website. She says maybe there's been a mistake. Maybe the pregnancy dates are wrong. Maybe I'm further along than I think. I tell her the ultrasound confirmed the dates and they align exactly with the colonoscopy. She asks if I've considered that maybe Kevin isn't remembering correctly either. Maybe they had sex and he forgot too. I hang up on her. Kevin's parents are more supportive, but I can see the discomfort when they look at me. I'm carrying a pregnancy that resulted from assault, and it makes everyone uncomfortable. They don't know what to say or how to help. They default to awkward silence and forced optimism that everything will work out. When the DNA results arrive, Detective Morrison calls me to the station. She's with ADA Nathan Cruz, and they both look sick. Cruz is in his 40s, a career prosecutor with a reputation for taking sex crimes seriously. He says the DNA is a definitive match. Dr. Philip Castellanos is the biological father of the fetus I'm carrying. The probability of paternity is 99.997%. There's no ambiguity and no alternative explanation. While I was sedated for a routine medical procedure, the anesthesiologist who was supposed to be ensuring my safety instead sexually assaulted me. Morrison says they're arresting Castellanos immediately on charges of sexual assault of an incapacitated person. She says the DNA evidence is conclusive and they're building a comprehensive case. She asks if I'm willing to testify, and I say absolutely. Cruz warns me that defense attorneys will attack my credibility and claim I consented to something I don't remember. He says they'll suggest I had an affair with Castellanos and am lying to cover it up. I tell him I was unconscious. There can't be consent when someone is sedated for a medical procedure. He says he agrees, but that defense attorneys will try everything to create reasonable doubt. Dr. Castellanos is arrested at the hospital during his shift on a Thursday morning. Video of him being let out in handcuffs makes the local news by noon. The story explodes across media. Local outlets run headlines about an anesthesiologist accused of assaulting a sedated patient and impregnating her. My name is kept confidential as a sexual assault victim, but everyone at the hospital knows. The medical community is a small world. Within days, I start getting calls from other women. Detective Morrison says she's been contacted by 3 other women who had procedures where Castellanos was the anesthesiologist and now have questions about things they experienced. One woman named Diana Cooper says she woke from knee surgery with unexplained soreness and bruising in intimate areas. She told the recovery nurse, who said it was probably from positioning during surgery. Diana hadn't questioned it at the time, but now seeing the news, she wonders if something else happened. Another woman, Priya Sharma, says she'd felt violated after waking from her appendectomy 3 years ago. She couldn't explain why, but something felt wrong about her body. She'd told her husband, who said she was probably disoriented from anesthesia. She'd told the surgeon during a follow-up, who'd said confusion and disorientation were normal after surgery. She'd tried to forget about it, but the feeling had never gone away. Now seeing Castellanos' arrest, she wonders if her instincts had been right. A third woman, Jessica Lynn, says she'd complained to hospital administration about waking with her underwear on incorrectly after a colonoscopy 2 years ago. The underwear had been inside out and backwards. She'd been certain she'd put it on correctly that morning. She'd filed a complaint saying something felt wrong. Gerald Hutchins himself had investigated and concluded that Jessica had probably adjusted her clothing while confused from anesthesia. He'd suggested she was mistaken about how she'd dressed that morning. The complaint had been filed and dismissed within a week. The police investigation expands dramatically. Detective Morrison assembles a task force specifically for the Castellanos case. They request records of every procedure where he'd served as anesthesiologist over the past 5 years at this hospital. The list is staggering, over 800 procedures. They create a team to contact every female patient who'd had procedures requiring sedation with Castellanos present. They're looking for patterns of extended recovery times, unexplained complications, patient complaints, or any concerning notes in medical records. The hospital resists initially, claiming patient privacy. Victoria Lang argues they can't just contact hundreds of women and alarm them without specific cause. Cruz gets a court order compelling the hospital to provide the information. The outreach begins and the responses are disturbing. Within 2 months, they've identified 23 women who had concerning experiences. Some reported unexplained pain or soreness after procedures. Others had complained about extended recovery times explained as adverse reactions. Several noticed their clothing had been adjusted strangely. A few had gaps in surveillance coverage during their procedures for technical reasons. Many had filed complaints with the hospital that were investigated and dismissed as misunderstandings or medication effects. 7 women agree to come forward publicly. The stories are horrifyingly similar. Extended recovery times explained away, gaps in nursing coverage during those times, patients waking with feelings of violation they couldn't explain, complaints to hospital staff that were dismissed as confusion or anxiety from medication. Castellanos had been assaulting sedated patients for at least 5 years, and the hospital had either missed the signs or ignored them deliberately. Victoria Lang and the hospital's legal team go into full crisis mode. They issue statements saying they had no knowledge of any misconduct and are cooperating fully with law enforcement. They suspend Castellanos immediately without pay and launch an internal review. But the internal review finds what victims had been trying to report for years. 12 formal complaints about Dr. Castellanos in hospital files dating back 5 years. Nurses reporting he'd requested to be left alone with patients in recovery more frequently than other anesthesiologists. Patients reporting feeling violated or uncomfortable after procedures where he'd been present. Families questioning why recovery took so long when the actual procedures were brief. Every single complaint had been investigated by hospital administration and dismissed. The investigations were perfunctory, usually just asking Castellanos if the allegations were true and accepting his denials. No independent review, no pattern analysis, no comparison of complaints across multiple patients, no serious scrutiny of someone in a position to exploit unconscious patients. The hospital had chosen to protect their staff member over listening to vulnerable patients. One particularly damning document surfaces during the internal review. 3 years ago, a recovery nurse named Amanda Phillips had sent a detailed memo to Gerald Hutchins expressing concerns about Dr. Castellanos. She'd noticed that patients assigned to him seemed to have more extended recoveries and more complaints of confusion than patients with other anesthesiologists. She documented 6 specific cases where patients woke disoriented and made concerning statements about feeling violated or uncomfortable. She'd recommended a formal review of his practices and suggested having a second staff member present during all his procedures as a precaution. Hutchins had responded by email saying Amanda was overreacting and that different anesthesiologists had different practice styles. He'd said Castellanos used a different sedation protocol that resulted in grogginess that some patients interpreted as disorientation. He'd told Amanda to stop spreading rumors that could damage a colleague's reputation. The memo had been filed and forgotten. Amanda Phillips had left the hospital 6 months later and now worked at a different facility. Detectives tracked down Amanda and interview her. She says she'd felt something was wrong with Castellanos but couldn't prove it. She says patients would say things while semi-conscious that disturbed her. Things about feeling touched inappropriately or sensing someone close to them in ways that felt invasive. But when they fully woke, they'd attribute those feelings to dreams or confusion from medication. She'd documented her concerns and tried to get administration to take them seriously. When Hutchins dismissed her memo and implied she was causing problems, she'd realized the hospital wasn't going to protect patients. She'd stayed long enough to find a new job, then left. She says she's felt guilty ever since for not doing more. She says she should have reported to medical boards or police, but she'd been afraid of retaliation and wasn't sure she had enough evidence. The guilt has eaten at her for 3 years. She asks if her speaking up now can help the investigation. Detective Morrison says absolutely, and thanks her for coming forward. The media coverage intensifies as more victims come forward, and the hospital's failures become public. National outlets pick up the story of the anesthesiologist who'd assaulted dozens of sedated patients over years while the hospital ignored warnings. Investigative journalists from major newspapers start digging into Castellanos' history. They uncover that this isn't his first hospital where concerns were raised. He'd worked at Riverside Medical Center in a different city for 7 years before coming to our hospital. Journalists contact Riverside administration and request records about why Castellanos had left. Initially, Riverside refuses to comment, citing confidentiality, but under pressure and facing their own potential liability, they release limited information. Castellanos had left Riverside Medical after a patient there accused him of inappropriate touching during a procedure. The patient, Melissa Torres, had woken from gallbladder surgery and reported to the recovery nurse that she felt like she'd been sexually assaulted. She'd had clear memories of being touched intimately in ways that had nothing to do with her surgical site. The hospital had investigated and interviewed Castellanos, who denied everything. He'd said Melissa was confused from anesthesia and probably having a reaction to the medications. He'd suggested she might be misinterpreting normal medical procedures. The hospital attorney had met with Melissa and offered a confidential settlement of $75,000 in exchange for her signing a non-disclosure agreement and agreeing not to report to police or medical boards. Melissa had been 23 years old and scared. She'd signed the agreement and taken the money. The hospital had allowed Castellanos to resign quietly, with the official reason being he'd accepted a position at another facility. His reference letter was glowing and made no mention of any complaints or concerns. Journalists tracked down Melissa Torres, who's now 32 years old and married with children. She's devastated learning that Castellanos went on to assault dozens more women. She says she's lived with guilt for 9 years, knowing she'd taken the settlement and let him go unpunished. She says she was young and afraid, and the hospital's lawyers made her believe no one would take her seriously if she reported. They'd told her that without physical evidence, it would be her word against a respected doctor. They'd said trials were traumatic and she'd be torn apart by defense attorneys. They'd said the settlement was the best outcome she could hope for, so she'd signed and tried to move on. But seeing the news now about so many other victims, she knows she made the wrong choice. She contacts ADA Cruz and offers to testify. She says she still has copies of the settlement agreement and hospital records despite the NDA. She says she doesn't care about violating the confidentiality clause. She wants to help put Castellanos in prison. Cruz is thrilled to have Melissa's testimony because it establishes a pattern of predatory behavior across multiple institutions. He says it shows Castellanos wasn't making impulsive mistakes, but was a serial predator who sought positions specifically to access unconscious patients. The defense will try to exclude Melissa's testimony as prejudicial and not directly related to the current charges. But Cruz argues it shows modus operandi and pattern. He files motions to include her testimony and other previous allegations as evidence of systematic predation. The judge will rule on admissibility later, but Cruz is confident it will be allowed. The previous hospital, Riverside Medical Center, now faces their own lawsuit from Melissa for the initial assault and for enabling Castellanos to continue. She argues the settlement and confidential reference letter directly led to other women being assaulted. If Riverside had reported Castellanos to medical boards and police, he would never have been hired at our hospital. The 23 known victims at our hospital exist because Riverside chose reputation protection over public safety. Her lawsuit seeks damages not just for her own assault, but for contributing to subsequent assaults. Legal experts say it's a novel legal theory but has merit. Riverside's insurance company immediately tries to settle again, but Melissa refuses. She says she's not taking another quiet payoff. She wants public accountability. Meanwhile, my pregnancy progresses while the case builds. I'm 4 months pregnant with my rapist child and struggling with every aspect of it. The nausea is severe and I don't know if it's pregnancy hormones or trauma. Every prenatal appointment triggers anxiety because I'm in a medical setting where I was assaulted. I can't let doctors touch me without having panic attacks. My OB, Dr. Emily Trudeau, is patient and understanding. She lets me bring Kevin to every appointment. She explains everything before touching me. She gives me control over the exams, but nothing makes it easier. I'm carrying a pregnancy that shouldn't exist and facing impossible choices about what to do. Kevin and I discuss termination. I'm within the legal time frame in our state, though, barely. We meet with a counselor at a reproductive health clinic who explains options. She's careful not to pressure me either direction. She says some assault survivors choose termination as a way of reclaiming control over their bodies. Others choose to continue the pregnancy for various reasons. She says there's no right or wrong choice, only what's right for me. I schedule a termination appointment for the following week. But when the day arrives, I can't go through with it. Not because of politics or religion, but because despite everything, there's a part of me that feels connected to this pregnancy. The baby is innocent. The baby is also half mine genetically, even if the other half came from violence. I call Kevin from the clinic parking lot and tell him I can't do it. He says he supports whatever I decide. We discuss carrying to term and placing for adoption. This feels more manageable. I can get through the pregnancy with therapy support, then place the baby with a family who will love and raise her without the trauma attached. Kevin says he's okay with this if it's what I want. But as the pregnancy progresses and I feel the baby move, the decision becomes more complicated. I'm bonding with this life inside me even though I hate how it got there. I'm grieving the future where Kevin and I planned our pregnancy together, and it was joyful instead of traumatic. I'm angry that a decision that should have been mine was stolen by a predator who took advantage of my unconscious body. I'm devastated that every milestone of this pregnancy is tainted. I should be excited about feeling the baby move. Instead, I'm nauseated by the reminder of what happened. The preliminary hearing happens when I'm 5 months pregnant and visibly showing. I have to sit in court with my pregnant belly while Castellanos' attorney Marcus Blackwell argues there's insufficient evidence for trial. Blackwell is in his 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit. He's known for defending doctors accused of sexual misconduct and has a reputation for aggressive tactics. He argues that DNA only proves paternity, not assault. He suggests I had a consensual affair with Castellanos and am now lying to cover it up. He says I'm upset about an affair gone wrong and trying to destroy an innocent man's career. He says there's no evidence of assault other than my claims and that reasonable doubt exists. He says forcing this to trial would be a miscarriage of justice against a dedicated physician with an unblemished record. ADA Cruz presents the evidence systematically. My testimony about no sexual contact with anyone except my husband for months before and after the procedure. Kevin's testimony confirming our timeline and our lack of intimacy during the relevant period. Medical records showing I was sedated and incapacitated during the colonoscopy. Hospital logs showing Castellanos was alone with me for over 2.5 hours during recovery. Nurse Beth Kowalski's testimony about being told to leave and returning to find my gown adjusted differently. DNA proving Castellanos is the biological father. Cell phone records showing Castellanos and I had no contact before or after the procedure, destroying the affair narrative. My medical records showing the gastrointestinal issues that made intimacy painful, explaining why Kevin and I hadn't been sexually active. Cruz argues that an unconscious sedated patient cannot consent, and that Castellanos had exclusive access during the precise conception timeframe. He says the evidence is overwhelming and demands trial. The judge is a woman in her 60s named Judith Kowalski. She listens to both sides and reviews the evidence carefully. She asks Blackwell pointed questions about his affair theory. She asks how an affair could occur between two people who had no contact before or after a single medical procedure. Blackwell says affairs can happen quickly during brief encounters. Judge Kowalski says that doesn't explain the pregnancy resulting from an encounter that occurred while I was unconscious during a medical procedure. She asks if Blackwell is suggesting I consented to sexual activity while sedated. Blackwell tries to argue that I might have been more conscious than records indicate. Judge Kowalski cuts him off. She says the medical records clearly show I was under deep sedation for over 3 hours. She says the case presents serious questions about medical sexual assault. She finds probable cause and orders Castellanos to stand trial on 1 count of sexual assault of an incapacitated person. The other victims hold a press conference organized by a victims' rights advocacy group called Survivors Speak. 7 women stand together in front of news cameras and describe being assaulted by Dr. Philip Castellanos while sedated for medical procedures. Diana Cooper describes waking from knee surgery with bruising and soreness she couldn't explain. Priya Sharma describes the feeling of violation after her appendectomy that everyone told her was imaginary. Jessica Lynn describes waking with her clothing disturbed and being told she was confused. 4 other women share similar stories. All of them had filed complaints with the hospital. All had been dismissed and told they were mistaken or confused. They described the hospital's failure to protect them and the trauma of not being believed. They announced they're filing a class action lawsuit against the hospital for negligence in hiring and supervising Castellanos and for ignoring complaints that should have triggered investigation. The press conference is covered nationally and goes viral online. The hospital's stock price drops 23% in one day. Administrators are grilled at a board meeting by furious stakeholders. Patients start canceling procedures and transferring care to other facilities. Staff morale collapses as employees realize they've been working alongside a predator for 5 years. Several senior administrators are forced to resign, including Gerald Hutchins, who dismissed multiple complaints. The hospital board brings in new leadership and promises comprehensive reforms. They announce a patient safety initiative, independent review of all medical staff, enhanced surveillance systems, and mandatory training on recognizing and reporting abuse. But the damage is done. The institution that was supposed to keep patients safe had instead enabled a predator for years. Trust is destroyed, and no amount of promised reform can change what happened to us. My pregnancy continues its difficult progression. I'm 6 months along and have gained 28 pounds. The baby is healthy according to ultrasounds, a little girl. I've decided definitively on adoption. Kevin and I interview potential adoptive parents through an agency. We meet 3 couples before finding the right match. David and Lauren are in their late 30s and have struggled with infertility for 8 years. They're kind and genuine and promise to love this child completely. They know the circumstances of conception and don't judge. They say every child deserves love regardless of how they came into the world. We go through counseling together to prepare for open adoption, where I'll receive updates but won't be involved in parenting. It's the best option I can find in an impossible situation. I'll give birth, and then let this child have a life untainted by the trauma of her conception. The criminal trial begins in September when I'm 7 months pregnant. Castellanos pleads not guilty to 23 counts of sexual assault of an incapacitated person, 1 for each identified victim. Marcus Blackwell's defense strategy is to attack the victims systematically. He suggests we're lying for attention or money from lawsuits. He claims the timeline coincidences are just that, coincidences. He argues that women who were unconscious can't possibly know what happened and are filling in gaps with imagination fueled by media hysteria. He points to me as the instigator who started a witch hunt that convinced other confused women they'd been assaulted. He says I'm an unreliable narrator who created a false memory and then convinced others to share in the delusion. He says the pregnancy is unfortunate but proves nothing about assault because I must have been conscious at some point and consented. Adia Cruz systematically destroys these arguments. He calls me to testify first. I sit in the witness box 7 months pregnant and describe the colonoscopy, the sedation, the extended recovery, waking with feelings of violation I couldn't name, finding out I was pregnant 3 months later with conception timing that matched only the colonoscopy. Cruz asks if I had any relationship with Castellanos before or after the procedure. I say no. We never spoke except during pre-op when he introduced himself. Cruz asks if I consented to sexual activity during the procedure. I say I was unconscious and unable to consent to anything. He asks how I know conception occurred during the colonoscopy. I explain the timeline, the lack of other sexual activity, the DNA results proving paternity. Cruz asks how this pregnancy has affected me. I describe the trauma, the impossible choices, the grief of carrying my rapist child. Blackwell's cross-examination is brutal. He asks invasive questions about my sexual history with Kevin. He suggests I'm misremembering our timeline and we must have had sex without me recording it in my app. He asks if I've ever had memory problems or blackouts from my medications. He asks if I'm certain I didn't have an affair and forgot about it. He suggests I could have met Castellanos socially and had a consensual encounter I'm now mischaracterizing. Every question is designed to paint me as unreliable or dishonest. Cruz objects repeatedly and the judge sustains most objections. But the damage is done. The jury hears the implications that I'm lying or crazy or covering up an affair. Blackwell suggests the adoption plan proves I don't really believe the baby resulted from assault. He says if I truly believed I'd been raped, I wouldn't be able to carry the pregnancy at all. The argument is circular and offensive, but it plants doubt. Cruz calls Kevin, who testifies about our timeline and relationship. Kevin confirms we hadn't been intimate for months due to my health issues. He describes the shock of discovering the pregnancy and figuring out the timing. He says there's no question the conception occurred during the colonoscopy. Blackwell cross-examines him aggressively, suggesting Kevin is covering for his wife's infidelity. He asks if Kevin has ever suspected I was unfaithful. Kevin says no. Blackwell asks if he's certain I never left the house without his knowledge. Kevin says I was barely functional from gastrointestinal pain during that period and was definitely not having an affair. Blackwell suggests Kevin is in denial and wants to believe the assault story rather than face his wife's betrayal. Kevin's face turns red with anger, but Cruz objects before he can respond. The other 6 victims testify over 3 days. Diana Cooper describes waking from knee surgery with unexplained injuries. The defense suggests she injured herself moving during surgery. Priya Sharma describes feeling violated after her appendectomy. The defense suggests post-surgical confusion created false memories. Jessica Lynn describes her clothing being disturbed. The defense suggests she dressed incorrectly that morning and was misremembering. Each woman is attacked and dismissed, but the consistency across their stories builds a pattern. They didn't know each other before the case. They had different procedures at different times, yet they all describe similar experiences: extended recovery times, feelings of violation, complaints to the hospital that were dismissed, Castellanos having unsupervised access during periods when surveillance was incomplete or absent. The pattern is damning. Cruz calls nurse Beth Kowalski, who testifies about being told to leave during my recovery. She admits leaving me alone with Castellanos for over 2 hours. She says she'd never had concerns about him before and trusted he'd monitor me appropriately. She describes returning to find my gown adjusted and me more disoriented than typical. The defense suggests nothing she observed proves assault occurred. Beth says she's worked as a recovery nurse for 15 years, and something felt wrong that day, even if she couldn't articulate what. She says in retrospect, the signs were there, but she'd missed them because she'd trusted a colleague. Cruz calls Amanda Phillips, the former nurse who'd filed the memo expressing concerns about Castellanos. She testifies about noticing patterns of extended recoveries and patient complaints. She describes writing the detailed memo to Gerald Hutchins recommending review of Castellanos' practices. She reads the memo aloud in court, then reads Hutchins' dismissive response telling her to stop spreading rumors. She describes feeling powerless to protect patients when administration wouldn't take concerns seriously. She says she's felt guilty for years for not doing more. The defense attacks her credibility, suggesting she had a personal grudge against Castellanos. Amanda says she barely knew him professionally and had no personal relationship. She says she'd simply noticed concerning patterns and tried to report them properly. Cruz calls expert witnesses. Dr. Sarah Feldman is a forensic psychiatrist who specializes in medical sexual assault. She testifies that predators in medical settings specifically target unconscious patients because they're vulnerable and unlikely to remember assaults clearly. She explains how sedation drugs affect memory formation and why victims often doubt their own experiences. She describes how Castellanos' pattern matches known characteristics of medical predators. They select positions with access to incapacitated patients. They manipulate circumstances to be alone with victims. They exploit trust in medical institutions. They rely on victims' uncertainty and institutions' reluctance to believe accusations against respected professionals. Her testimony provides context for understanding how Castellanos operated for years without detection. Another expert, Dr. Michael Torres, is a pharmacologist who specializes in anesthesia. He testifies about propofol and other sedatives used during procedures. He explains how these drugs render patients completely unconscious and unable to form memories. He confirms that patients under the sedation levels documented in my records would be incapable of consent. He testifies that the extended recovery time noted in my records is unusual for a routine colonoscopy. He says while adverse reactions occur, they're relatively rare and typically involve specific cardiovascular or respiratory symptoms that would require different interventions than simple extended monitoring. He says my records don't show the typical symptoms of genuine propofol reactions, suggesting the extended time might have been fabricated to explain why I was in recovery so long. Cruz presents the DNA evidence through a geneticist who explains the paternity testing process. The probability of Castellanos being the father is 99.997%. There's no reasonable doubt about biological paternity. The only question is whether conception occurred consensually or through assault. Cruz argues the circumstances make consent impossible. I was unconscious. I was under medical care. I was in a position of vulnerability and trust. Castellanos was in a position of authority with a duty to protect me. Any sexual contact under those circumstances is assault regardless of memory or resistance. Cruz calls Melissa Torres, the woman from Castellanos' previous hospital. She describes her gallbladder surgery 9 years ago and waking with clear memories of being touched sexually. She describes reporting to staff and being dismissed. She describes the hospital's investigation and settlement offer. She testifies about signing the NDA under pressure from hospital attorneys who convinced her she couldn't win if she pursued charges. She describes learning about the current case and realizing her silence had enabled Castellanos to assault dozens more women. She says she'll carry that guilt forever, but hopes her testimony helps achieve justice now. Blackwell objects strenuously to her testimony as prejudicial and irrelevant to the current charges. Judge Kowalski allows it as evidence of pattern and prior bad acts showing propensity and modus operandi. The prosecution rests after 2 weeks of testimony. Blackwell calls character witnesses who testify that Castellanos was a dedicated physician and family man. Colleagues say he was professional and competent. His wife testifies that he's a loving husband and father who would never do what he's accused of. But Cruz cross-examines each witness about whether they'd known about Castellanos' private activities. None had. They'd seen the public persona he presented, not the predator he was with unconscious patients. Cruz asks Castellanos' wife if she knew about the complaints and investigations. She says no, he'd never mentioned them. Cruz asks if she knew about the settlement at Riverside. She looks shocked and says she had no idea. The revelation that Castellanos had hidden his entire predatory history from his own wife undermines the character defense. Castellanos never testifies in his own defense. Blackwell advises him not to take the stand where he'd be cross-examined about every assault. His silence is his constitutional right, but it means the jury never hears him deny the allegations directly. In closing arguments, Cruz stands before the jury and says 23 women had their bodies violated by a man who took an oath to do no harm. He says Castellanos exploited the ultimate vulnerability of unconscious patients to satisfy his own depravity. He says the DNA evidence proves assault occurred during a medical procedure. He says the pattern across multiple victims and multiple hospitals proves this wasn't confusion or misunderstanding, but systematic predation. He says every one of these women deserves justice and conviction is the only way to achieve it. Blackwell argues the evidence is circumstantial and based on assumptions rather than facts. He says uncomfortable coincidences don't equal guilt beyond reasonable doubt. He says assault accusations require more than suspicious timing and confused memories. He says convicting would set a dangerous precedent where any pregnancy could become a criminal case if a woman regretted her choices. He suggests we're all suffering from some collective delusion fed by media hysteria. He says Castellanos is an innocent man being destroyed by false allegations. The argument rings hollow after 2 weeks of damning testimony, but he has nothing else. The jury deliberates for 3 days. I spend those 72 hours in agony, 8 months pregnant and waiting for a verdict that will determine whether my assault is validated or dismissed. On the third day, the jury announces they've reached a verdict. We return to court and the forewoman reads guilty verdicts on all 23 counts. The courtroom erupts with crying and gasps. Castellanos shows no emotion, sitting perfectly still at the defense table. The judge thanks the jury and schedules sentencing for 6 weeks later. Castellanos is remanded to custody without bail. As guards lead him away, he looks at me for the first time during the trial. The expression on his face is blank. No remorse, no acknowledgement, nothing. He's led away and I collapse into Kevin's arms, sobbing. Outside the courthouse, the 7 of us who testified publicly stand together for photographs. We're survivors who brought down a predator despite institutional failure and brutal defense tactics. We held him accountable when every system had failed to protect us. Media coverage is extensive. Legal experts call it a landmark case proving that medical sexual assault can be prosecuted even without traditional evidence when DNA, circumstances, and pattern evidence create an overwhelming case. Medical boards across the country announce increased scrutiny of anesthesiologists and new protocols requiring continuous dual monitoring of sedated patients. Several states pass laws requiring video surveillance in all procedure and recovery areas. The reforms come too late for us but might protect future patients. I go into labor 2 weeks after the guilty verdict. The labor is complicated by my PTSD and panic attacks. Dr. Trudeau and the delivery team are patient and gentle, but nothing makes it easier. I'm giving birth to my rapist child in a hospital where I was assaulted. Every medical intervention triggers flashbacks. Every time someone touches me, I flinch. Kevin holds my hand and talks me through contractions. After 18 hours of labor, I deliver a healthy girl weighing 7 pounds 4 ounces. The nurses ask if I want to hold her and I say yes. They place her on my chest and I look at this tiny person who's completely innocent of how she came into the world. She has dark hair and gray eyes. She has Castellanos' nose and my chin. She's beautiful and heartbreaking, and I love her and hate what she represents in equal measure. I hold her for 3 hours while Kevin sits beside us. David and Lauren arrive and I introduce them to their daughter. Lauren is crying as she holds the baby. She thanks me for this gift even though gift doesn't feel like the right word. I didn't choose this, but the baby is innocent and deserves love and a good life. I sign the relinquishment papers with tears streaming down my face. Kevin holds me while I sob. The grief is complicated and layered. I'm grieving the loss of this child I carried for 9 months. I'm grieving the violation that created her. I'm grieving the future I'd imagined where Kevin and I planned our family together joyfully. We go home to an empty nursery we'd set up but never used. The room has a crib and changing table and stuffed animals. All of it purchased during the pregnancy when I was trying to pretend things were normal. Now it's just a reminder of everything that was stolen. Kevin and I don't discuss keeping the room. We pack it all up and donate it within a week. We need the space cleared of reminders. But the grief follows me everywhere. I see babies on the street and wonder about the daughter I gave away. I see pregnant women and feel nauseated remembering my own pregnancy. I can't watch television shows with hospital scenes without having panic attacks. Sentencing happens 3 months after I give birth. I'm physically recovered but emotionally shattered. The 7 of us who testified publicly attend along with 16 other victims who hadn't been comfortable testifying but want to be present for sentencing. The courtroom is packed with victims, families, media, and community members who followed the case. Judge Kowalski allows victim impact statements and we've all prepared written testimony. I'm scheduled to speak first. I walk to the podium and face Castellanos, who sits at the defense table with his attorney. I've written my statement but end up speaking from memory because the words are carved into my soul. I describe the colonoscopy and waking up feeling violated. I describe discovering the pregnancy and the horror of realizing what must have happened. I describe giving birth to my rapist child and placing her for adoption. I describe the nightmares and panic attacks. I describe never feeling safe in medical settings anymore. I describe how Castellanos didn't just assault my body but stole my ability to trust doctors, to plan my family, to control my own reproduction. I describe the impossible choices I had to make about a pregnancy I never wanted. I tell him he destroyed my sense of safety and security. I tell him I'll never recover completely from what he did. I tell him he deserves to die in prison. I sit down and Kevin squeezes my hand. Diana Cooper describes panic attacks before any medical procedure now. She can't even go to the dentist without sedation anxiety. Priya Sharma describes trust issues that destroyed her marriage. Her husband couldn't handle her trauma and left her. Jessica Lynn describes years of therapy trying to understand why she felt violated when she couldn't remember the assault clearly. One by one, we tell our stories while Castellanos sits emotionless. Some victims are crying, others are angry. All of us are united in demanding the maximum sentence. When we finish, Judge Kowalski looks at Castellanos with undisguised contempt. She asks if he has anything to say before sentencing. Blackwell advises him to remain silent. Castellanos shakes his head. Judge Kowalski says she's reviewed sentencing guidelines, victim statements, and the presentence investigation report. She says Castellanos had systematically exploited unconscious patients for over a decade across multiple hospitals. She says he'd violated the trust placed in medical professionals and destroyed the lives of dozens of women. She says the psychological harm he'd caused is immeasurable. She says aggravating factors include the number of victims, the duration of offending, the abuse of professional position, and the complete lack of remorse. She sentences him to 25 years to life in state prison with sentences for each count running consecutively. Effectively, he'll serve a minimum of 200 years before parole eligibility. He'll die in prison. She also orders him to pay restitution to all victims, though we know he has no assets after legal fees depleted everything. The class action lawsuit against the hospital settles 7 months later for $45 million, divided among all identified victims. I receive $8 million as the most publicized victim with the strongest evidence of assault. Money doesn't fix what happened, but it acknowledges institutional failure and ensures I can afford therapy and medical care for trauma for the rest of my life. The settlement includes mandatory reforms, 2-person rules requiring dual monitoring for all sedated patients, continuous video surveillance in all procedure and recovery areas with recordings stored for 5 years, independent review board to investigate any complaint against medical staff, annual audits of sedation practices, mandatory reporting of any concerns to state medical boards, zero-tolerance policy for dismissing patient complaints. New leadership implements these changes and makes the hospital's safety protocols public to rebuild trust. But I'll never forget that these changes came too late for 23 women who'd already been assaulted. Riverside Medical Center settles Melissa Torres's lawsuit for an undisclosed amount reported to be over $10 million. They also implement similar reforms and issue a public apology for failing to protect patients and for allowing Castellanos to move to another hospital where he continued offending. The medical community nationwide begins examining how predators hide in positions of trust and how institutions enable abuse through inadequate oversight. Several other medical professionals are investigated and prosecuted after victims come forward inspired by our case. The conversation shifts from individual bad actors to systemic failures that allow predators to operate. Kevin and I struggle through 2 years of intensive couples therapy trying to salvage our marriage. The trauma nearly destroys us. He develops his own PTSD from watching me suffer. He has nightmares about not protecting me even though there was nothing he could have done. He struggles with anger at the medical system and guilt that he'd encouraged me to get the colonoscopy that led to my assault. We fight about small things because we're both carrying enormous pain. Our therapist, Dr. Raymond Kowalski, helps us understand we're both grieving multiple losses. The loss of safety, the loss of the child we gave up, the loss of the future we'd planned. We have to rebuild our relationship from the ground and decide if we want to stay together or separate. It takes 2 years of brutal work, but we decide to stay together. We love each other and refuse to let Castellanos destroy our marriage along with everything else. 3 years after the assault, I'm finally ready to try for a pregnancy on our terms. We go through IVF using Kevin's sperm and my eggs, with genetic testing to confirm everything before implantation. I can't take the risk of any uncertainty about paternity after what happened. The IVF process is successful and I become pregnant with Kevin's biological child. This pregnancy is completely different emotionally. It's wanted and planned and joyful. Every milestone is celebrated instead of tinged with trauma. I give birth to a healthy son we name Andrew. Holding him and knowing he's ours in every sense makes me cry with joy and grief simultaneously. Joy for this new beginning. Grief for everything that was stolen 3 years ago. The daughter I placed for adoption sends photos through the Open Adoption Agency. She's 3 years old now, beautiful and happy, and clearly loved by David and Lauren. They've named her Sophie. The updates come quarterly, and I treasure each one while also feeling complicated grief. Sophie is my biological daughter, but not my child. She'll grow up knowing she was adopted, and eventually she'll learn about her biological origins. David and Lauren plan to tell her in age-appropriate ways as she gets older. They'll explain that her birth mother was hurt by a bad person, but chose to give her life and placed her with a family who could love her. I hope Sophie never feels unwanted. I hope she understands I loved her enough to give her a life free from trauma. Castellanos is in maximum security prison 3 hours from our home. I receive annual notifications of his custody status. He's been attacked by other inmates twice when they learned he's a rapist. Other prisoners have their own code about sex offenders. He's been placed in protective custody for his own safety, which means he's effectively in solitary confinement 23 hours a day. I don't feel satisfaction in his suffering because nothing he experiences can match what he did to us. But knowing he's locked away and can never hurt another unconscious patient brings a measure of peace. He'll be 75 years old before his first parole hearing. He'll likely die in prison before then. The reforms implemented after his conviction have led to 3 other anesthesiologists being caught and prosecuted for similar crimes in other states. The continuous video surveillance and 2-person monitoring requirements work when implemented seriously. Several assaults were caught on camera, and predators were arrested before they could assault multiple victims. My case created precedent and awareness that changed how medical sexual assault is handled. Prosecutors nationwide now know that DNA evidence combined with circumstantial evidence can build solid cases even without victim memory of the assault. Defense attorneys can't as easily dismiss victims as confused or lying when there's a pattern across multiple patients. 5 years after my assault, I found a new normal. I work as an advocate for victims of medical sexual assault through a nonprofit organization called Medical Justice Now. I help other survivors navigate reporting, investigation, and prosecution. I testify as an expert witness in cases involving assault of incapacitated patients. I lobby for stronger oversight of medical professionals and mandatory surveillance in vulnerable areas. I speak at medical schools about the importance of patient safety and recognizing predatory behavior. I've turned my trauma into activism that protects others. It doesn't erase what happened to me, but it gives meaning to the suffering. Kevin and I have rebuilt our lives and marriage. We have Andrew, who's now 2 years old and trying for a second child. We've moved to a different city where no one knows our history unless we choose to share it. We're building a future that isn't defined by what Castellanos did to us. The trauma is still there. I still have panic attacks in medical settings. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still struggle with trust and control issues. But I'm healing incrementally. Therapy continues weekly and will probably be lifelong work. But I'm no longer defined solely by being a victim. I'm a survivor, an advocate, a mother, a wife rebuilding her life despite catastrophic violation. The other survivors from our case have found their own paths to healing. Diana Cooper became a patient advocate at a major hospital helping implement safety reforms. Priya Sharma went to law school and now represents medical malpractice victims. Jessica Lynn started a support group for assault survivors that's grown to chapters in 12 states. We stay connected through a private online group where we support each other through difficult moments. We celebrate victories and milestones. We remind each other we survived something that tried to destroy us. The bonds formed through shared trauma are complicated but real. We understand each other's struggles in ways others can't. Amanda Phillips, the nurse who tried to report concerns about Castellanos, became a national advocate for healthcare workers who witnessed concerning behavior. She lobbies for protections for whistleblowers and mandatory investigation protocols that can't be dismissed by administration. She speaks at nursing conferences about the importance of trusting instincts and reporting concerns even when institutions resist. Her advocacy has led to policy changes at hundreds of hospitals nationwide. The memo she wrote 3 years before my assault that was dismissed by Gerald Hutchins is now used in training programs as an example of how institutions fail when they prioritize reputation over safety. Melissa Torres used her settlement from Riverside Medical to fund a nonprofit providing legal representation for victims of medical assault who can't afford private attorneys. She says money can't undo her own trauma, but using it to help others achieve justice gives purpose to the settlement she once felt guilty about taking. Her organization has helped over 200 victims pursue legal action against their assailants and the institutions that enabled them. She says she's found healing through advocacy work that transforms her victimization into protection for others. 7 years after my assault, Castellanos dies in prison. He's 59 years old and suffers a heart attack in his cell. The notification arrives by mail with a standard form letter informing me of his death. I feel relief and anger and disappointment simultaneously. Relief that he's gone and can never hurt anyone again. Anger that he died relatively quickly rather than serving decades in prison. Disappointment that he never showed remorse or acknowledged what he'd done. He maintained his innocence until death, convinced to the end that he was a victim of false accusations rather than a predator who destroyed dozens of lives. His death brings closure, but not the satisfaction I'd imagined. There's no justice in a heart attack, no accountability, just an ending. The other survivors and I hold a private gathering after learning of his death. We meet at Diana's house and share memories of the trial and recovery journey. We talk about how his death affects us differently. Some feel relief that he's gone. Others feel cheated that he didn't serve his full sentence. All of us acknowledge that his death doesn't erase what he did or heal our trauma, but it does mark a chapter ending. We're no longer living in a world where Philip Castellanos exists. That counts for something. 10 years after my assault, I'm 38 years old with 2 children and a career as a patient safety advocate. Andrew is 7 and his sister Claire is 3. Neither knows yet about the circumstances that led to my advocacy work. We'll tell them age-appropriate versions as they get older. Sophie is 10 now, and I receive updates showing a happy child thriving with her adoptive family. The relationship is complicated but stable. I love her and grieve her, and am grateful she has a good life simultaneously. Kevin and I celebrated our 15th wedding anniversary last month. We survived something that destroys most marriages. The fact that we're still together and happy proves we're stronger than the trauma that tried to break us. The reforms implemented after Castellanos' conviction have become standard practice nationwide. The Joint Commission, which accredits healthcare facilities, now requires continuous monitoring and surveillance during all procedures involving sedation. Medical boards have enhanced screening for professionals with access to vulnerable patients. Hospitals have mandatory training on recognizing and reporting predatory behavior. The changes came too late for the 23 of us Castellanos assaulted, but they've protected countless other patients from similar predators. My assault led to systemic changes that will protect future generations. That's not redemption, but it transforms meaningless trauma into meaningful prevention. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.